Jungkook was laughed at while singing at military exercises. However, when the genie appeared, the mood changed dramatically. Why did everyone suddenly apologize? Asterisk, haha. Is that a cow's voice or moan? Asterisk laughter broke out among the soldiers sitting in a circle in the training hall. Jungkook stood in the middle of the room, his face stiffened, hands clenched at his sides. The sound of scorn continued to buzz in his ears, piercing his pride deeper than the fatigue from weeks of strenuous training. His eyes swept across the room. Some soldiers patted their thighs with laughter, others clutched their bellies, as if they had just heard the best joke of the year. Meanwhile, his sweat-soaked uniform felt heavier on his body, as if laughing at him as well. He tried to stay upright, but something was gnawing at his confidence. Does it really sound that bad? Asterisk, asterisk, you think this is a concert stage, huh? K-pop star? Asterisk, one of the soldiers, a stocky man with a senior badge on his chest, walked over. His face was full of mockery. This is not your place. Stop pretending to be a great singer. Asterisk, Jungkook's heart beat harder. His hands clenched tighter. He wanted to speak, wanted to defend himself, but the words seemed to be stuck in his throat. At that moment, the door of the hall opened loudly. Jin came in. The pace is steady. His eagle eyes swept across the room, leaving a suffocating silence. A slanting smile was engraved on her lips. Not the warm smile that her fans are used to, but something sharper, colder. What happened here? His voice was flat, but there was a power behind it that made anyone in the room hold their breath. No one dared to answer. Jin stepped closer. This time, not as a world-known idol, but as a senior in the military, someone who had gone through the rigors of training first. He looked at the faces of the soldiers who were laughing at Jungkook. Then he spoke, and in just a few words, everything changed. What did you just say? Jin's voice was calm, but there was something sharp in it, something that made the entire room tense up. The laughter had died. The soldiers who had been jeering at Jungkook moments ago now looked anywhere but at Jin. Jungkook swallowed hard. His heart was still pounding from the humiliation, but now another feeling was creeping in. Relief? No, something heavier. Expectation. That Jin's gaze locked onto the senior soldier who had mocked Jungkook the loudest. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and clearly used to having control over the room. But right now, under Jin's scrutiny, he shifted uncomfortably. I asked you a question, Jin continued, stepping forward. His boots echoed against the cold concrete floor. What did you say about his voice? The senior soldier hesitated, then scoffed, trying to reclaim his confidence. I was just joking, Sunbae. Having a little fun. Jin let a soft chuckle. It was humorless. Cool. Fun, he echoed. Do you know what real fun is? The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. No one dared to speak. Then, without warning, Jin's voice cut through the air like a blade. It's when you survive a night march with a 20-kilo pack on your back, knee-deep in mud, and still have the strength to sing. His eyes never wavered. It's when you spend hours doing push-ups until your arms give out, but you still hum a song to keep your spirits up. Jin's expression darkened. Fun is when you stand by your brothers in arms, lift them up, and remind them why they're here. Not tear them down for something you don't understand. The senior soldier clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. No one did. Jungkook stared at Jin, his chest tightening. Jin turned slightly, finally looking at Jungkook. His gaze softened, but only slightly. Sing again. Jungkook blinked. Young. Sing, Jin repeated. Louder this time. Every eye in the room turned to Jungkook. His throat felt dry. The memory of their laughter still echoed in his head. But there was something in Jin's expression, a quiet challenge that a deep breath. A moment of hesitation. Then, Jungkook opened his mouth and sang. His voice was raw, unsteady at first, but he pushed through. Each note carried the weight of his exhaustion, his frustration, and the fear he had swallowed down for weeks. But there was something else in it too. Determination. That'd be why the time he finished, the room was silent. Not with mockery this time. With something else. Respect. Jin nodded once, satisfied. Then, he turned back to the others. Now who's laughing? No one said a word. Jin smirked. Thought so. Again. Jin's voice was firm, his gaze unwavering. Jungkook swallowed hard, his throat still raw from the first song. His body ached from the day's brutal drills, his muscles screaming for rest. But he knew this wasn't about his voice anymore. This was a test. He took a deep breath and started singing again. This time his voice was stronger, more controlled. The room remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer filled with ridicule. It was filled with scrutiny. Some soldiers exchanged glances, as if trying to process what was happening. But the senior soldier, the one who had mocked him earlier, crossed his arms. His expression was unreadable. "All right," he finally spoke, his voice slow, deliberate. "So you can sing? But this isn't a talent show, soldier. Can you endure what we do?" Jungkook tensed. He had been expecting this. Jin, however, simply smiled, a dangerous, knowing smile. "You want to test him?" The senior soldier smirked. "Let's see if he lasts through the night drill." Murmurs filled the room. The night drill was infamous, a grueling endurance test meant to push soldiers to their absolute limits. Running for hours through the forest, carrying heavy packs, climbing obstacles, and barely stopping to breathe. Jin turned to Jungkook, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" Jungkook met his gaze. His body was exhausted, his muscles weak, but deep inside him, something flared to life. He clenched his fists and nodded. "I'll do it." The night drill begins. The moon hung high in the sky as the soldiers lined up at the starting point. The ground was uneven, the forest ahead dark and unwelcoming. The cold air bit into Jungkook's skin, but he ignored it. "Go!" The soldiers took off, boots slamming against the ground. Jungkook forced himself to keep up. The heavy pack on his back dug into his shoulders, making every step feel like a battle. Within minutes, sweat dripped down his forehead. His breath came in short gasps. But he pushed forward, branches whipped against his arms. His legs burned as they climbed steep inclines. The weight on his back felt like it was crushing him. But he didn't stop that he wouldn't stop. Somewhere behind him, Jin was watching. Jungkook could hear the other soldiers breathing heavily, some already slowing down. The senior soldier, the one who had challenged him, ran just ahead, glancing back every so often as if waiting for Jungkook to collapse. But he didn't. He kept going. Then, bang, a sudden flare exploded in the sky, signaling the final stage of the drill. Jungkook's body screamed for rest, but he gritted his teeth. Just a little more. His vision blurred, his legs trembled. His mind begged him to stop. But then he heard it. A voice. Jin's voice. "Sing." Jungkook gasped. His mind reeled. Now? In the middle of this? But Jin's order wasn't a request. So, with the last of his strength, Jungkook sang. His voice cut through the night, shaky at first, then stronger. The other soldiers turned, disbelief written all over their faces. But Jungkook wasn't singing for them. He was singing to prove, to himself, to them, to Jin, that he wasn't just an idol, he was a soldier. And as his voice carried through the darkness, the senior soldier who had doubted him finally stopped running. Not because he was tired, but because he was stunned. Jungkook hadn't broken. The moment Jungkook's voice rang through the night, everything changed. The soldiers who had doubted him, who had mocked him just hours ago, now stared in disbelief. His voice wasn't just a song. It was a declaration, a challenge, a refusal to break. The senior soldier, still ahead of him, clenched his jaw. Damn it. How is he still going? Jungkook's breath was ragged, his legs weak, but he kept running. The pack on his back felt heavier than ever. His muscles screamed for mercy, but he didn't stop. Not now. Not when he was so close. Jin's command echoed in his mind. "Sing." He hadn't understood it at first. Why, in the middle of the hardest drill of his life, would Jin tell him to sing? But now, as his voice carried through the night, he realized this was his strength. Singing wasn't just something he did on stage. It wasn't just entertainment. It was his willpower, his weapon. And in that moment, it was keeping him alive. The final obstacle up ahead, the forest opened to a brutal sight, a steep cliff, its rocky edges slick with moisture. At the bottom, a rope bridge swayed dangerously over a rushing river. Jungkook's heart pounded. The challenge was clear. They had to climb down the cliff, cross the bridge, and make it to the other side before the final flare went off. The other soldiers hesitated. Even the senior soldier looked uncertain. The cliff was treacherous. One wrong step could mean a serious injury. Jungkook wiped sweat from his brow. His breathing was heavy, but he stepped forward first. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest, but he would be the bravest. He grabbed the first jagged rock, testing his grip. The stone was cold and rough beneath his fingers. Slowly, carefully, he began his descent. The wind howled around him, the weight of his pack threatening to throw him off balance. His fingers ached as he clung to the rocks. Below, the rope bridge creaked, swaying in the wind. One mistake, and he would fall. The other soldiers started to follow. Some moved cautiously, others hesitated. Then, a scream. Jungkook's head snapped up just in time to see one of the soldiers lose his grip. His body tilted backward, hands scrambling for something. Anything to hold on to. Jungkook moved without thinking. In a split second, he lunged, grabbing the soldier's wrist just before he slipped. The soldier gasped, his body dangling over the edge. His eyes were wide with fear. "I got you." Jungkook gritted his teeth, his muscles straining to hold the weight. The pack on his back pulled him down, but he refused to let go. His arms trembled, his grip slipping, and then another hand gripped his arm. Jin. Without hesitation, Jin anchored them both, his expression unreadable but firm. "Pull," he ordered. With one final burst of strength, they hauled the soldier back up. He collapsed onto the rock, breathing hard, staring at Jungkook in shock. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, "You saved me." The soldier's voice was hoarse, disbelieving. Jungkook, still panting, managed a small nod. And in that moment, something shifted. The way they looked at him, their expressions of doubt, of mockery, it was gone. Replaced by something new. Respect. The last step with renewed energy, the soldiers climbed down and crossed the rope bridge. Jungkook was the last to step onto the wooden planks. His body was battered, his lungs burned, but he wasn't the same person who had started this drill. As he reached the other side, the final flare shot into the sky. They had made it. A breathless silence followed. Then, the senior soldier, who had doubted him the most, stepped forward. He stared at Jungkook for a long moment. And then he saluted. Jungkook's eyes widened. One by one. The other soldiers followed, but a silent acknowledgement of the warrior's respect. Jin, standing at Jungkook's side, smirked. "Not bad, soldier." Jungkook exhaled, a small, exhausted smile forming on his lips that he had passed the test. But something told him this was just the beginning. Jungkook stood at attention, sweat trickling down his temple. His uniform was soaked, his muscles ached, but the respect in the soldier's eyes made the pain worth it. For the first time since entering the military, he wasn't just Jungkook the idol, he was Jungkook the soldier. But then, everyone fall in. "Now!" A booming voice shattered the silence. Jungkook snapped his head up. A man in a dark green uniform, with medals glinting under the barack lights, strode forward. His presence was suffocating, cold, commanding. Commander Choi. The air grew heavy. Every soldier instantly straightened, their expressions stiff with discipline. Even the senior soldier who had mocked Jungkook earlier looked uneasy. Commander Choi's eyes scanned the group before settling on Jungkook. "So, this is the singer who thinks he can survive my camp." Jungkook clenched his fists. "Sir, yes, sir," he answered, his voice unwavering. Commander Choi smirked. "I don't care if you're a superstar. In my unit, respect isn't given, it's earned. You think one night drill proves something?" Jungkook felt his heart pound. "No, sir," he replied. Choi nodded slowly. "Good. Then you won't mind proving yourself again." Jungkook inhaled sharply. A new test. Jin, standing beside him, didn't look surprised. Instead, a smirk tugged at his lips, as if he had been expecting this. "You've impressed the man," Choi continued, "but I'm not convinced. So tomorrow, you'll undergo the Hell Week simulation, a test that breaks even the strongest soldiers." A murmur rippled through the ranks. Hell Week.it was a legendary test, a grueling 6-day endurance challenge designed to break even elite trainees. No sleep, constant physical and psychological pressure, near impossible obstacles. Jungkook's stomach tightened. 6 days of hell. Any objections? Choi asked, voice daring him to refuse. Jungkook's heart pounded. His body was already exhausted, his mind still recovering from the night drill. But if he refused now, if he backed down, everything he had fought for would be meaningless. He raised his chin, squared his shoulders, and met Choi's eyes. I accept. Day 1. The breaking point. Before dawn, Jungkook was dragged out of bed by a blaring alarm. The other soldiers were already up, moving quickly. His body protested as he stumbled to his feet, exhaustion still weighing him down. Move it, recruit, one of the instructors barked. Jungkook sprinted outside, where cold rain pelted down mercilessly. The sky was still dark, the air frigid. Drop and give me 50. Jungkook hit the ground, palms slamming into the wet dirt. His arms shook as he pushed himself up and down, his muscles screaming from the abuse. The moment he finished, he was ordered to sprint 5 kilometers through the rain, carrying a 20-kilo sandbag. His breath came in ragged gasps. The weight on his shoulders felt unbearable. But he pushed forward. Day 2. Sleep deprivation. Jungkook sat stiffly in the cold, his body trembling. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. His mind was a haze, his vision blurry. He had spent the last day crawling through mud, swimming through ice-cold water, running endless miles, all while being yelled at and forced to make split-second decisions. Now he and the other recruits sat in a dimly lit room, forced to stay awake. The instructors walked around, ready to punish anyone who even blinked too long. His body begged for rest. His head bobbed forward. Bang! A metal baton slammed against the table in front of him. Jungkook jolted awake, his heart nearly jumping out of his chest. I said, stay awake, the instructor snapped. Jungkook gritted his teeth. Yes, sir. He refused to break, but in the corner of his eye, he noticed something that a few recruits were watching him. And unlike before, their eyes weren't filled with amusement or doubt. They were watching to see if he would survive. Day 4. The water challenge under the water. Now, Jungkook plunged into the freezing tank, the cold searing into his skin like 1,000 needles. He had to stay underwater for 2 minutes while carrying a rifle and a backpack filled with weights. His lungs burned. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The pressure in his chest grew unbearable. But then he saw Jin, standing on the sidelines, watching, not with worry, with expectation. Jungkook clenched his teeth. He refused to fail. He pushed through the pain, the cold, the panic, until the whistle blew. When he surfaced, gasping for air, the instructor smirked. Not bad, singer boy. And for the first time, Jungkook saw it, the tiniest glimmer of approval in the commander's eyes. The final test. Day 6. Jungkook's body was wrecked. He had cuts on his arms, bruises on his knees. His muscles were beyond exhaustion. But he had made it this far. And now he stood in front of the final test, a 12-hour march through the mountains, in full gear, with no food or water. The other soldiers were just as exhausted, some barely standing. But they weren't looking at him with doubt anymore. They were looking at him as one of them. Jungkook tightened his straps, adjusted his backpack, and looked at Jin. Jin smirked. Ready. Jungkook, despite the pain, grinned. Let's finish this. And as the final challenge began, he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just a singer. He was a soldier. You fall, you fail. You stop, you're done. Move. The instructor's voice cut through the freezing mountain air like a blade. Jungkook adjusted his pack, ignoring the way his shoulders screamed in protest. His body was beyond exhausted. Every muscle felt like it was tearing apart. His skin was raw from the cold wind, and his stomach was hollow from 48 hours without food. Yet he kept walking. The final test of Hell Week was simple. Collision, a 12-hour forced march through the mountains. Collision, no food, no water. Collision, no stopping. Most of the soldiers beside him had undergone months of training before this. But Jungkook, he had been thrown into the fire weeks after enlistment. And yet, he was still here. Ahead of him, Jin walked steadily, his expression unreadable. Jungkook didn't know how he still had so much strength left, but he followed him. He had made it this far. He would not fall now. Hour 2. The mountain's wrath. The path was steep, the loose rocks shifting beneath his boots. Every step sent pain jolting through his legs, but stopping wasn't an option. The wind howled, sending chills through his soaked uniform. Focus, Jungkook muttered to himself. One step at a time. Suddenly, a scream. Jungkook's head snapped up just in time to see a soldier lose his footing. The man's body tilted dangerously, his foot slipping on the jagged rocks. And then he fell. Jungkook moved instantly. Without thinking, he lunged, grabbing the soldier's wrist just before he tumbled down the steep cliffside. The weight yanked Jungkook forward, his own boots skidding against the gravel. Pain shot through his shoulder as the strain nearly tore his muscles apart. Then, Jin's hand clamped onto his arm. With a sharp pull, they hauled the soldier back up. The man collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard, his face pale with shock. Jungkook exhaled, his chest rising and falling rapidly. That was too close. The other soldiers who had once doubted him now looked at him with something new. Not just respect, trust. On your feet, Jin said, his voice calm but firm. The soldier nodded weakly, pulling himself up. Jungkook flexed his sore fingers, his heart still pounding. They couldn't stop. The march continued. Hour 6. The breaking point. Jungkook's legs burned with every step. His throat was dry, his vision blurred. Somewhere along the way, 2 soldiers had collapsed, unable to continue. The medics had taken them away. Jungkook refused to be next. How much longer? He rasped. Jin glanced at his watch. 6 more hours. Jungkook clenched his jaw. He had already survived 6 hours of hell. But could he survive 6 more? The thought clawed at his mind. Then the hunger hit. His stomach twisted violently, the emptiness gnawing at him. The hallucinations started next. The trees blurred, shifting into strange shapes. His mind whispered lies. Sit down. Just for a second. You've done enough. No one will blame you if you quit. Jungkook shook his head violently. I know he wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing it for the soldiers who had doubted him, for the ones who now trusted him, for Jin, for everyone who had ever thought he was too soft for this life. His jaw tightened. He kept walking. Hour 10. The storm just when Jungkook thought things couldn't get worse. The rain started. Cold, sharp droplets pelted against his skin, soaking him instantly. The ground turned to mud, his boots sinking deeper with every step. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind lashed against them mercilessly. Jungkook felt his strength slipping. His body was on the verge of collapse. And then he heard it. A voice. Keep moving. Jin. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't demanding. It was just 2 words, but it held them together. Jungkook gritted his teeth. He took another step, then another, and another. Hour 12. The finish line at exactly midnight. The soldiers reached the base of the mountain. Jungkook's body gave out. He collapsed onto his knees, gasping for air, the mud soaking through his uniform. Around him, other soldiers were doing the same, panting, trembling, but alive. They had made it. Jungkook felt a hand on his shoulder. Jin. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. And that was enough. The commander's verdict. A few hours later, Jungkook stood in front of Commander Choi. The entire unit was present, watching. The commander eyed him for a long moment. You should have broken, he finally said. Jungkook's heart pounded. But you didn't. Choi stepped forward. Not bad, recruit. A slow smirk tugged at his lips. Then he saluted. Jungkook's breath hitched. He saluted back. And in that moment, he knew he had won. Not just their respect, not just their acceptance, but his own place among them. This isn't training anymore. Jungkook felt the shift before anyone said a word. The air was different, colder. He stood at attention with the rest of the unit, his uniform still damp from the rain, his body aching from the final march. The exhaustion in his bones hadn't faded, but something was off. Jin stood beside him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Then, Commander Choi stepped forward. His usual smirk was gone. His posture was stiff, his eyes sharp. Something was wrong. At ease, Choi said, his voice lower than usual. The soldiers relaxed slightly, but no one spoke. Then Choi exhaled. An incident occurred last night, he said. This is no longer just training. We're on alert. Jungkook's heartbeat quickened. An incident, Choi continued, his gaze sweeping over them. A group of unidentified individuals infiltrated a nearby military post. Equipment was stolen. Tracks lead toward our area. Jungkook's stomach tightened. This wasn't just an exercise anymore. This was real. And suddenly, the past weeks of grueling drills, the exhaustion, the survival training, the pain, made sense. They weren't just preparing him to survive. They were preparing him for war. The Midnight Watch Jungkook's first real mission started that night. He was assigned midnight watch duty along with Jin and 3 other soldiers. Their job? Patrol the perimeter. They were given live ammunition. Jungkook swallowed hard as he adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder. It felt heavier than before. The 5 of them moved silently through the dense forest, their boots crunching against the damp earth. The moon was barely visible, swallowed by thick clouds. The wind rustled through the trees, but everything else was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Jungkook tightened his grip on his weapon. Something's off, one of the soldiers muttered. Jin, walking ahead, raised a hand, a silent signal to stop. Jungkook froze, his pulse hammering. Then, a branch snapped. Everyone tensed up. Jungkook's eyes scanned the darkness. He strained his ears, but the silence pressed against him like a vice. Then, a shadow moved. There, one of the soldiers hissed. Jungkook turned just in time to see a figure dart between the trees. His blood turned to ice. Identify yourself, Jin shouted, raising his weapon in a response. Then, gunfire, a single shot rang out through the night. Jungkook's breath caught his throat as the bullet whizzed past his ear, missing him by inches. Instinct took over. He hit the ground, rolling behind a tree, his heart pounding out of control. Contact! We have hostiles! Jin roared. The radio crackled as soldiers back at the base responded. Jungkook's hands shook, his body paralyzed for half a second. This wasn't training. This was real. The enemy was real, and they were shooting to kill. Fight or die, Jungkook. Move! Jin's voice snapped him back to reality. Jungkook tightened his grip on his rifle. His breath came in his sharp gasps as he forced himself to peek out from behind the tree. He saw 3 figures moving in the shadows, armed. Fast, not amateurs. Another shot rang out, this time hitting the tree inches from his head. Jungkook's instinct screamed at him to run, but he didn't. Instead, he did what he trained for. He aimed and fired. The recoil sent a shock through his shoulder, but his bullet hit. Not a fatal shot, but enough to graze the attacker's arm. The figure stumbled, cursing in a language Jungkook didn't recognize. Then Jin moved fast. Precise. Deadly. In a blink, he took down one of the attackers with a well-placed shot. The remaining 2 disappeared into the trees. A tense silence followed. Jungkook's chest heaved. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then, a voice crackled through the radio. Base to patrol team. Hold position. Jungkook swallowed hard. He had just survived his first real firefight, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Jin crouched beside him, eyes sharp. First time being shot at. Jungkook nodded slowly. Jin studied him for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and tossed something at him. Jungkook caught it automatically. A piece of gum. He blinked. What? Chew. Jin said simply. It helps. Jungkook hesitated, then popped the gum into his mouth. The taste of mint flooded his senses, grounding him. Jin smirked. Not bad for a singer. Jungkook exhaled a shaky breath. That he wasn't just an idol anymore, that he was a soldier. And now, he was in the middle of something much bigger than himself. That wasn't just a random attack. They knew exactly where to hit. Jungkook sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the rifle in his hands. His fingers were still raw from gripping it too tightly, his ears still ringing from the gunfire. For the first time since enlisting, fear had settled deep in his bones. Not the kind of fear he felt before stepping on stage. This was different. This was the kind of fear that told him this wasn't over. Across from him, Jin leaned back against the wall, chewing lazily on another piece of gum like nothing had happened. But Jungkook wasn't fooled. Jin had been different ever since the attack. More silent, more watchful. And that only made Jungkook's unease grow stronger. Then, the siren blared. Jungkook shot up, adrenaline flooding his veins. Commander Choi's voice roared through the speakers. All units, report to briefing immediately. This is a level 1 emergency. Jungkook exchanged a glance with Jin. A level 1 emergency. That was the highest threat level. Something was seriously wrong. The briefing, a traitor in their midst? The soldiers filled the briefing hall in record time. Jungkook slid into place beside Jin, heart pounding. Commander Choi stood at the front, his expression dark. As you all know, our base was attacked last night, he began. The enemy was well-equipped, well-trained, and most importantly, his eyes swept over them. They knew exactly where to strike. A heavy silence settled over the room. Jungkook felt the realization sink in. This wasn't just a random raid. Someone had given them inside information. That means one thing, Choi continued. We have a traitor among us. A ripple of shock spread through the soldiers. Jungkook stiffened at a traitor? One of them had leaked their positions? The commander's next words sent chills down his spine. Until further notice, no one is to leave the base. Everyone is under suspicion. Jungkook clenched his fists. This just got a lot more dangerous. The interrogations begin. The atmosphere in the barracks had changed. The usual camaraderie was gone, replaced with unease and paranoia. Every glance felt suspicious. Every whispered conversation felt like a secret. Then, the interrogation started. Soldiers were pulled into the commander's office, one by one. Some came back pale-faced. Others didn't come back at all. Jungkook tried to stay calm, but the tension was suffocating. Then, Jin's name was called. Jungkook's heart nearly stopped. Jin? Jin was being questioned. He watched as his friend got up, completely unfazed, and walked into the commander's office without hesitation. Jungkook's pulse hammered in his ears. Was it possible? Could Jin be? No, it couldn't be. Right? Jin's secret Jin was gone for 2 hours. When he finally came back, his face was unreadable. Jungkook couldn't take it anymore. What the hell was that? He whispered urgently. Jin glanced at him. Relax. They just ask questions. Jungkook narrowed his eyes. That's it. Jin smirked. What? You think I'm a traitor? Jungkook hesitated. No. But why were you in there so long? Jin's smirk faded. For a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then he sighed and leaned in. I didn't tell you before, he murmured, voice low. But I've been on this case since the beginning. Jungkook froze. What? I knew something was off before the attack happened. Jin said. That's why I wasn't surprised. I've been watching. Jungkook's mind raced. You knew there was a traitor? Jin shook his head. Not for sure. But now, I have a suspect. Jungkook swallowed hard. Who? Jin's eyes darkened. I can't say yet. But if I'm right, we're in deeper trouble than we thought. Jungkook felt a chill crawl down his spine. This wasn't just about passing training anymore. This was about survival. And for the first time since arriving, he didn't know who he could trust. The silent watcher that night. Jungkook couldn't sleep. Jin's words haunted him. I have a suspect. Who? His mind replayed the past few days, the patrol, the attack, the interrogations. Someone inside the base had given the enemy information. And whoever it was, they were still here. Jungkook got up quietly, stepping outside into the cold air. The barracks were silent. The only sound was the distant howl of the wind. Then, a figure moved in the shadows. Jungkook tensed. Someone was sneaking toward the communication room. His pulse spiked. Was this it? The traitor? Without thinking, he followed. His breath came out in quiet puffs as he stepped lightly across the gravel, staying low. The figure reached the locked door at a pause. Then a keycard. The door clicked open. Jungkook's stomach dropped. That's impossible. Only high-ranking officers have access. Whoever this was, they were powerful. Jungkook's heart pounded as the figure slipped inside. This was his chance. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Step away from the door. Hands where I can see them. Jungkook's voice was low, steady. His heart? Anything but. The figure froze. For a split second, the silence was deafening. Only the faint hum of the bass's power grid filled the space. Then, the figure turned. Jungkook's breath hitched. You. His stomach dropped. The man standing before him wasn't some low-ranking soldier. It was Sergeant Kong, one of Commander Choi's most trusted officers. Jungkook's grip tightened on his rifle. His entire body screamed that this was wrong, that he shouldn't be pointing a gun at a superior. But the evidence was right in front of him. Kong had just unlocked the restricted communication room in the middle of the night. There was no excuse for that. Kong exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning Jungkook. "Lower the gun, kid," he said calmly. "You don't know what you're doing." Jungkook's hands didn't move. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he countered. "You were about to send something, weren't you? A message?" "Coordinates." Kang's lips twitched, not in fear, in amusement. And that scared Jungkook more than anything. "You're smarter than I thought," Kong murmured. "But you don't understand the full picture." Jungkook narrowed his eyes. "Then explain it to me." Kong took a slow step forward. Jungkook raised his weapon instantly. "Stay where you are." For the first time, Kang's expression darkened. Then, his radio crackled. "Status report, Kong. Did you deliver the package?" Jungkook's blood ran cold. Kang's lips curled into a smirk. He reached for his earpiece. Jungkook lunged. The fight Jungkook barely had time to react before Kong moved. Faster than expected, Jungkook's instinct screamed as Kong grabbed his rifle barrel, shoving it aside. Then, a punch straight to Jungkook's ribs. The impact stole his breath. Jungkook stumbled back, gasping. Kong followed up immediately, throwing another punch toward his face. Jungkook dodged just in time, the fist barely grazing his jaw. "Fight back. Now!" Jungkook swung his rifle up, ramming the butt of the gun into Kang's stomach. The sergeant grunted but didn't go down. Instead, he grabbed Jungkook's arm, twisting it. Pain shot through Jungkook's shoulder. He was losing. Kong shoved him backward. Jungkook's back hit the metal lockers. The breath knocked out of him. Kong exhaled, shaking his head. "You should have just walked away, kid." Jungkook refused. He gritted his teeth. "Not a chance." And then, the door behind Kong slammed open. A gun was pressed to his head. "Jin, step away from him," Jin said, voice deathly calm. Kong froze. For the first time, he looked worried. Jungkook coughed, his body aching. Jin's eyes flickered toward him, sharp but unreadable. "You good?" he asked. Jungkook wiped his mouth, tasting blood. "I've had worse." Jin's lips twitched. "You bet." Then his focus snapped back to Kong. "It's over, Kong." Kong didn't respond. Then, a flash of movement. Kong reached for his belt. Jin fired. A single, precise shot. The bullet buried itself in Kang's shoulder. The sergeant crashed to the floor, groaning in pain. Jungkook exhaled deeply. Jin stepped forward, pressing a boot to Kang's chest, keeping him pinned. "Now," he said, voice calm. "Start talking." The truth revealed. Kong clenched his teeth. Blood dripped from his shoulder wound. "You think you know what's happening here?" he rasped. "You don't know a damn thing." Jin crouched slightly, tilting his head. "Then enlighten us." Kong chuckled darkly. Then he leaned in and whispered, "There's more than one of us." Jungkook's breath caught. Jin's eyes darkened. "How many?" Kong smirked. "You'll find out soon enough." Jin clicked his tongue, then delivered a swift punch to Kang's already bruised jaw. Kang's head snapped back. "That was for Jungkook," Jin said flatly. Jungkook blinked. Jin shot him a quick glance. "What? You wanted to hit him, right?" Jungkook huffed a small laugh, despite himself. "Yeah, thanks for that." Jin nodded, then turned back to Kong. "You're done." Within minutes, military police swarmed the room. Kong was dragged away in handcuffs, his smug expression never fading. But Jungkook's stomach was still twisted in knots. "There's more than one of us." This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Jin sighed, rubbing his temple. "Great," he muttered. "Now we have to play detective." Jungkook exhaled. "So what's next?" Jin's gaze turned serious. "Now, we hunt them down before they make their next move." Jungkook nodded, jaw tightening. He wasn't just fighting for respect anymore, that he was fighting to protect the people around him. And this time, he wasn't going to lose. We were too late. Jungkook barely heard Jin's words over the sound of his own heartbeat. The base was in chaos. Sirens blared. Soldiers ran in all directions. The metallic scent of smoke and gunpowder filled the air. Fires flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows against the barracks. This wasn't just another attack. This was war. Jungkook's hands clenched into fists. There were more traitors inside the base, and now they had struck first. The explosion 10 minutes earlier. Jungkook and Jin had just handed Kong over to the military police when the first explosion ripped through the air. Boom! The ground shook violently. Jungkook barely had time to react before he was thrown off his feet, crashing into the dirt. His ears rang. His vision blurred. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then, boom! A second explosion. Jungkook forced himself up, gasping for air. Smoke curled into the sky. One of the armories was on fire. Jin's voice cut through the chaos. Jungkook, move! Jungkook turned just as Jin grabbed him, yanking him behind a stack of crates. Bullets whizzed past. They were under attack from inside the base. The enemy within Jungkook's hands trembled as he reloaded his rifle. This wasn't training. This wasn't a mission. This was survival. He peeked out from behind cover, his mind racing. Soldiers were scattered, some returning fire, others trying to control the flames. And then he saw them about a group of 6 men moving through the shadows, dodging between buildings. Not just random soldiers. They were organized. One of them turned. Jungkook's breath caught. No way. It was Lieutenant Han. One of Commander Choi's top officers. Jungkook's stomach churned. Kong wasn't lying. This went higher up than they ever thought. Han's gaze locked onto Jungkook. For a split second, their eyes met. Then Han raised his rifle. Jungkook dived aside, just as a bullet grazed his arm. The pain was instant. Jungkook clenched his teeth, gripping his wounded arm. Jin, he gasped. Jin moved like lightning. One shot, clean, precise. Bang! Han stumbled back, clutching his leg. But instead of retreating, he smiled. Too late, Han murmured. It's already begun. Then, a third explosion. The main power grid went dark, and the entire base was thrown into blackness. Hunting in the dark, the air was thick with smoke, fear, and silence. Jungkook's heart pounded as he pressed against a wall, his breath coming in short gasps. The lights were out. The radios were dead, and somewhere in the darkness, the remaining traitors were still moving. We need to stop them, Jin whispered, close to his ear. Jungkook nodded. Ow! We can't see anything. Jin's fingers brushed against Jungkook's wrist. Close your eyes. Jungkook blinked. What? Just do it. Jungkook hesitated, then obeyed. The moment his eyelids shut, his other senses sharpened. The sound of boots on gravel. The smell of burning fuel. The faint rustle of fabric as someone shifted nearby. Then, a breath. To his left, Jungkook moved without thinking. Crack! His rifle slammed into someone's chest. A choked grunt. Then a body hit the ground. Jungkook's eyes snapped open. One of the traitors lay at his feet. Unconscious, Jin smirked. Not bad. Jungkook exhaled shakily. How many left? Jin's face turned serious. Too many. They had to end this. Now. Commander Choi's last stand. The command center was in ruins. Jungkook and Jin stepped over shattered glass, moving quickly through the wreckage. Then, a familiar voice. You disappoint me, Lieutenant. Jungkook's breath caught. Commander Choi, he was still alive. They rushed forward, only to freeze in the middle of the destroyed control room. Choi stood tall, a pistol aimed at Han. Han, bleeding but still defiant, grinned. You're too late, Commander. Choi's hand didn't waver. Do you even understand what you've done? Han Vkook. Understand perfectly. We were never going to win the war outside these walls. So we decided to change the game. Jungkook's blood ran cold. You mean? Han smirked. Kid. This isn't an attack. It's a takeover. Jungkook's stomach dropped. They don't want to destroy the base. They want to control it. Jin exhaled sharply. Shit. Then Han moved. A flicker of motion, his hand reaching for his gun. Bang. Choi shot first. Han collapsed, The room fell silent. Then Choi turned, his sharp eyes landing on Jungkook. You did well, Private John. Jungkook swallowed hard. Is it over? Choi's jaw tightened. For now. But Jungkook knew. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Epilogue. A soldier's path 3 days later. The base was secure again. The traitors had been removed. But Jungkook? He wasn't the same as he packed his gear. Jin leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. So, Jin said, what's next for you? Jungkook paused. Then he looked down at his uniform. For the first time, he wasn't just an idle playing soldier, that he was a fighter. I think I'm going to stay. Jin raised an eyebrow. Oh, Jungkook smirked. There's still work to do. Jin's lips curled. Damn right. As the sun rose over the mountains, Jungkook took a deep breath. He had come here as a singer. Now, he was something more, and whatever came next, he was ready. The Yendi,